Welcome to Simply Sewing with Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and today let's talk about a seam finish that needs no special tools, does not need a zigzag, you don't need a serger, and all of the raw edges are not seen. And it is called a flat fell seam. It's very easy to do, and the look is beautiful from both sides. A flat fell seam is a very flat seam. It is flat from the front side, but it's also flat from the back side. You see no raw edges, and we don't need to do a zigzag or a serge stitch because the raw edges of the fabric are tucked inside. And it's a very easy seam to do. I'm using two different fabrics and a dark thread so you can see each step along the way. And we get to sew the fabric the same way as we normally do, with a 5/8 seam allowance. The right sides are together, and we get to stitch that 5/8 seam allowance all the way along. Once that stitching is done, we need to trim off one layer of fabric. So we can choose what side to trim off. The side we trim off will mean that seam is going in that direction. And I'll explain more of that later. So we need to take one edge and trim it down. So move all of the other fabric out of the way. The one seam is going to stay big, and we're going to trim off the other. And we want to leave about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So we can use a pair of scissors and just keep that top piece out of the way. We can trim that piece of fabric off. If you were a quilter, there is a quilting ruler that we can use, and it's called Add a Quarter. And what it is a ruler with a little 1/4 inch groove or a lip on it. And we're going to be able to use that with our rotary cutter. So we keep that fabric out of the way, and then just take that ruler and have it go right along that edge. And you can see where I have a 1/4 inch sticking out. Now I'm going to be able to use a rotary cutter and cut that off. It just saves a little bit of time. Now when I open this up, I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance and a 5/8 seam allowance. This 5/8 piece is going to wrap around and cover this little piece. So that top piece is just going to wrap around and encase that raw edge. And we need to leave that raw edge of that top fabric somewhere within that seam allowance. We don't want it to go into the fabric. It needs to stay within that seam allowance. And we need to do that for the entire seam. And we can glue this until we get to the next stage. And a child's washable glue stick will work just fine. Be sure it says washable on it. Just run a little bit of glue along that seam. Now take that and just roll it until it comes very close to that seam. So the glue is just holding that seam in place for us, and we can still see our stitching line. The raw edge needs to be covered, so the seam is going to be pressed, covering it. So that inside is covered, and when we stitch it over, the raw edge of the second seam is also covered. From here, I find it easier if I just press this fabric going in that direction and check both sides to make sure that there's no fold over in your fabric. So pressing it from both sides is just going to help the next row of stitching. And that way we have a nice clean edge and it's tight along the stitching line. With that seam being pressed from the front and the back, it's going to be really easy to do our next row of stitching. And we need to stitch right along that folded edge. We will see 2 rows of stitching when we're done. We need to stitch as close as we can along that folded edge. With that last row of stitching, it has made the seam flat. We have 2 rows of stitching from the back side and 1 row of stitching from the front side. And be sure to use a thread that's going to blend into this top piece. That's all there is to doing this seam. It remains flat on both sides. By trimming off this side, the seam is going in that direction. And that's a good thing to keep in mind as we're making our garments. For example, if we have a pocket in our garment, we will want the seam going in this direction. So the front piece is that little piece we're going to cut off of the seam allowance. If we want that shoulder seam to point towards the back, we will need to trim off the back piece. Depending on what direction we want the seam to go, is that piece that we trim off, and the seam is automatically going to go in that direction. This particular seam needs to be done after each row of stitching. Once you do one row of stitching, you can't proceed to the next step until you do this step. If so, when you come to an area where the seams need to join, you're not going to be able to get right to the end. So with each row, you finish the seam and then go on to the next step. And that gives us a beautiful finish on both sides. This is a very strong seam and a very attractive seam because the inside and the outside both look very nice. If you have a stretch fabric, it helps that seam stabilize. If you have a very soft weight fabric, it buries the raw edges so it always looks nice. It won't matter what garment you're making, we need to do one seam at a time, finish that seam, and then go to the next. And the entire garment is going to have that beautiful finished edge. This is also a great seam to use if you are making something reversible because it looks good from both sides. If you have a fabric that looks nice from both sides, like a suit jacket or a spring jacket out of a nice wool, because that way it looks good from both sides. And the little glue saves us from having to pin those seams. Thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're sewing next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.